Okej, zaczynamy. Good afternoon, everybody. Dzień dobry. This afternoon is the closing remarks, or we're going to have the closing remarks from a person who's particularly well qualified to make those closing remarks. Some of you perhaps have not had the opportunity to read the statement that Ambassador Fried made when he left the State Department in April after 40 some odd years of service to the United States government. But I urge you, if you're interested at all, to Google him, and you'll find out what he said. And he's very much going to speak today, I think, in the vein of what he said a few months ago in Washington. So Daniel Fried is a graduate of Columbia University's School of International Affairs, my classmate, somebody who spent an awful long time and has very, very sharp elbows because he is a Hercules of bureaucratic politics in Washington. He's seen it all, he's done it all. He is, despite his stature, a very powerful guy, and somebody who spent a number of years in a very important position as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State, created European policy and beyond, somebody who had the ear of the president, and somebody who for years and years acted on behalf of this country. The Polish political elite certainly knows Dan Fried terribly well, not only because he was ambassador here, but because when this country was trying to get into NATO, Ambassador Fried stood at the pinnacle of the group of people who was forcing this through the U.S. political elite, which was not convinced that NATO needed more members. In fact, I remember the argument very well: if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Well, he fixed it. And today NATO is a very different organization than it was in the 1990s, when things began to change very quickly in this part of the world. We've invited Ambassador Fried to make a few remarks, and he's generously agreed also to answer questions after he's finished. You know that we have microphones here so that if you have a question for Ambassador Fried, signal for a microphone to get to you, and please say your name and where you're from so we know who we're talking to. Ambassador Fried.
Dziękuję, panie profesorze. Dziękuję państwu. Cieszę się, że mogłem wrócić do Warszawy po tylu lat nieobecności tu. I przepraszam z góry, że muszę po angielsku speak, because my Polish has gotten a little rusty after many years outside of Warsaw. That's a gap I hope to rectify in the next few years. But in the meantime, please forgive me. 1 week ago, President Trump spoke at Plac Kraszinskich and gave the best foreign policy address of his presidency. He spoke of a community of nations, an alliance of countries united by values, among those values the rule of law, freedom of expression, freedom of speech. He spoke of a strong alliance of free nations. He spoke of a strong Europe. He then mentioned that Russia was acting in Ukraine and other ways as a destabilizing factor in the world, and therefore reaffirmed America's Article 5 commitment to Poland and to all the other NATO members. As I said, I think this was the best foreign policy speech of President Trump's new presidency. He reaffirmed, in essence, America's commitment to the free world. The free world is sometimes termed the liberal world order, but I really don't like that phrase, the liberal world order, because there are many people who don't describe themselves as liberals who belong in it, not outside it. I prefer the free world. And in recommitting the United States to the free world, President Trump was following a centuries-old tradition in the West. In Europe, the notion of a just international order rooted in transnational values is at least as old as Erasmus. Immanuel Kant elaborated a theory of perpetual peace between states committed to the rule of law and republican values. As my country, as America, emerged as a world power at the end of the 19th century, we developed our own American grand strategy, our version of the free world. We thought of ourselves as distinct from the European empires and spheres of influence of the time. In contrast, America sought an open, rules-based world, more just and simultaneously more profitable for ourselves and for others, because we Americans recognized that our interests, our prosperity, and our security were tied to the prosperity and security of other nations. We believe that the advanced democracies of the world should set the global agenda along the lines of this vision. An objective ambitious but also generous, because we understood America's national interest in broad, not narrow terms. In his memoirs, Kurier z Warszawy, Jan Nowak-Jezerański writes of astonishment at American humanitarian assistance to Poland in 1920 and wondered what sort of nation helped others and asked nothing for itself. But America understood that as we helped others, we in fact advanced our own interests, because America could not do good business with poor countries. We wanted to make the world a better place so we could all get rich. That was our American ambition and confidence. My nation developed the outlines of this grand strategy starting in 1900. But my country failed to apply it in the 1930s when Europe needed us most. Our failure was costly, nowhere more so than in Poland. But after 1945, recognizing our failure, we set out with what was left of Europe to build the free world. We contained Stalin's Soviet Union and rebuilt Western Europe. We established great institutions, NATO and what became the European Union, to make the new peace lasting. The achievements of the free world inspired the dissidents of Soviet-occupied Europe, including KOR i Solidarność tu w Polsce. And the people of Central Europe and Poland took down the Iron Curtain in 1989. In the early 1990s, as America contemplated our options, wise Poles from right to left made the case that the principles of the free world applied to all of Europe. Poles asked us, rhetorically, whether freedom was limited to Europe west of the line that Stalin drew, to which there was and is only one honorable answer. Thus inspired, NATO and Europe grew to embrace 100 million Europeans from the Baltic to the Black Sea. The free world worked, and Europe has enjoyed the longest period of peace, prosperity, and democratic governance in its history. And the one element I would have added to Donald Trump's speech, if I had been asked, was to recognize all that Poland has accomplished in the generation since 1989. I'm not a Pole, but it is possible to argue that this was the best generation in Poland's history since King Stefan Batory. That may be right. But if this achievement was so profound, what has gone so wrong? What accounts for current doubts and skepticism? What accounts for Brexit and the rise of national populism in Europe and in some parts of America. I would say this by way of explanation or attempted interpretation. First, economic stresses, even in successful Poland. The West in general has suffered through years of economic distortion, slow growth, high unemployment in much of Europe, and in America, levels of income inequality not seen in almost 100 years. Add to this pressure the challenge of national identity in the face of high immigration, Latino in the United States, Middle East, North African in Europe, Eastern Europe and some parts of the UK, and immigration traditionally generates nativist reactions in both Europe and America. I say this without approval, but there it is. The United States and the EU seem to have fallen short in response. American political institutions often seem paralyzed by partisanship, and many Europeans seem alienated from the EU's institutions, a sort of democratic deficit on both sides of the Atlantic. In this period of unease, Russia has resumed its role as corrosive political spoiler, maligned by intention, using propaganda, corrupt funding, and other active measures updated for the cyber age. Moscow's aim seems to be the same as in Soviet times, to weaken the West's institutions and discredit Western values, thus shielding Moscow's despotic system from liberal influence and easing Russia's domination of its neighbors, Ukraine first of all. The free world order is being challenged by another vision, a new nationalism, which rejects in principle the objectives of an open rules-based world led by the world's great democracies. Some of the new nationalists seem to regard values as an indulgence and prefer power politics and spheres of influence. They call on the power of the nationalist idea, and that idea does have a dark power. No need to tell Poles about the consequences of such a vision if it were to succeed. In place of the free world order, we would have great powers dominating their neighbors, unchallenged, arguing and fighting over their respective spheres of influence, and crushing rebellions from within. I cannot understand why anyone would advocate a return, in effect, to pre-1914 Europe or 1930s Asia, throwing away lessons it took millions of lives to learn. What then must we do, we who defend and seek to advance the free world? First, immediate business. Turn back Russian aggression. Defend Ukraine and help Ukraine defend itself. Maintain sanctions, intensify pressure on Moscow to settle and not prolong the conflict. And at the same time, push the Ukrainians to advance their own reforms. Resist Russian infiltration and leverage. We need to deal with Russian propaganda, cyber aggression, energy leverage, and all manner of hybrid threats. Engage Russia and the Russians. The Trump administration may seek, as did the Bush and Obama administrations, to develop a positive agenda with Russia. This can be useful if we do not expect too much, and if we avoid paying the Russians extra for cooperation. And we should reach out not just to the Russian government. We must not forget those Russians who have a better vision for their country. Dealing with Russia may be the easy part. We must also advance a transatlantic growth and jobs agenda. The free world order needs to deliver economically for its people and for the world. Closing economies is a loser's game, but open trade needs to be matched by pro-growth investment and other pro-growth policies. We must also challenge the new nationalism with a new patriotism. The nation and the nation state will remain fundamental. Americans will not give it up. Poles and others in Central Europe who have just regained their sovereignty, I suspect, will defend it. So will many in Western Europe. But the nation state and the good of the nation state is not an ultimate end, and the interests of the nation state are not the highest. In the Western tradition, tyrannical and aggressive rulers lose legitimacy and governments gain it as they act in accordance with universal principles. Nations and governments are answerable to those principles. Thus, we embrace the France of liberté, égalité, fraternité, and we find compelling the slogan of Polish patriots, za waszą I naszą wolność. The West needs to make room for patriotism bound to higher principles. That is the West, and that is the Western tradition. We may also need to find ways to open the nation, understanding it along cultural and linguistic, not only ethnic tribal terms. My country, America, is founded on a principle that all men are created equal. And as Lincoln said, immigrants to America become Americans as they accept this principle. This open American definition of nationality may have something to teach. British identity, as being a British person, is in principle cultural and transnational. So is the French civic definition of nationality. This is not easy, as America's painful history shows. But the free world must challenge this century's new nationalism, which is in many ways just a cheap remake of the 20th century original, with a better patriotism. A strong, confident Europe, based on the nation state properly conceived, tied to Europeans, may yet emerge. In the end, we who believe in the free world must believe in ourselves and our values, as Poles believed in themselves and their values in the darkest days of martial law. Among those values, our interests are best served as our values advance. These values include the rule of law at home in a rules-based world, human rights and democracy, and the prosperity they can generate. A strong state with strong institutions, both independent and rooted in law, remains fundamental. Free nations' interests advance or decline together. The nation state, even the free world, are not ends in themselves, but earn legitimacy as they serve these higher purposes. And finally, the world's great democracies must lead together to these ends, for if we do not lead, the world will be led by the world's great autocracies, who are waiting like a demon crouching at the door. We must rule over them. Let us rediscover our faith in these ideas, the best of the West, and act to preserve, defend, and extend our legacy. Thank you.
Okay, let's open the floor to questions and answers.
Zapraszam.
There's a question.
Thank you, Dan. This was fantastic. Michał Baranowski, I'm at GMF Warsaw. Thank you so much for your speech and for your writing and for all your service. You know that you have only friends here, and it's always so fantastic to hear you. I wanted to ask you about the debate inside the US that we are seeing sometimes through reading important speeches within, debates within the body politic. And especially wanted to ask you about the vision of Europe whole, free and at peace. I mean, this was a vision that guided your work. This was a vision that, that was incredibly important to our part of the world, but it's it's not a done deal by far. I wanted to ask you, how is this vision still there?